Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Before we get started, I would like to start today's event by reading UW Superior's Land Acknowledgement Statement. In honor of the Anishinaabe people, the original peoples and caretakers of this land, we would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Superior inhabits the land of the Ojibwe people. Please take this moment to honor and celebrate ancestral Ojibwe land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples. So hello again, everyone. My name is Allie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the community and voter engagement interns for Jackets Vote at UW Superior's Link Center. So the Link Center is a central point of access for community partnership between the university and the region as a whole. The Link Center serves to listen, innovate, and connect. Jackets Vote is all about ensuring that the voices of UW Superior students are heard by providing them with necessary tools and resources to get registered, get educated, and to get out the vote. We promote nonpartisan civic and voter engagement efforts for UW Superior students, faculty, staff, and the community. Today's panel, inspired by the American Bar Association's Law Day 2022 theme, Toward a More Perfect Union, the Constitution in Times of Change, is meant to discuss the relationship between the United States Constitution, voting, and civil liberties. Joining us today are Carl Crawford, Nate LeCoussier, and Don Ness. Throughout today's panel discussion, if anyone has any questions, please send them to us by using the chat function on Zoom, and there will be time at the end for a Q&A. So our first speaker today, Carl Crawford, was selected by Mayor Emily Larson as Duluth's Human Rights Officer in July of 2016, after he served as Lake Superior College's Intercultural Center Coordinator since 2007. As the Human Rights Officer, Carl is charged with enforcing city and state human rights laws and works to ensure city services are accessible to all people without discrimination. In addition, the Human Rights Officer also serves as the Equal Opportunity Representative for the City of Duluth and the ADA Coordinator responsible for enforcement of policies against discrimination and harassment, diversifying the workforce, and promoting accessibility for all residents. Carl brings a deep history of community involvement in human rights work to the position, including helping to draft the original Human Rights Ordinance, serving as post-chair of the Human Rights Commission, and was a founding board member of the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial. In addition, Carl has served on numerous board of directors, including Community Action Duluth, Duluth Area Chamber of Commerce, Woodland Hills, Menace Peacemakers, the Ordine Foundation, SOAR, the NAACP, and American Cancer Society. He is the recipient of the 2012 Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Peace Award, is active with the Family Freedom School of Duluth, and is a longtime youth and high school basketball coach. Carl, we're so excited you're here with us today.
Thank you so much, Allie. I'm so excited to be here today and to join you on this important day at UWS. You know, one of the things that is not in my bio is probably one of the most important titles, and that is voter. And I'm here today to talk about how important the 1965 Voters' Rights Act is to our country, for everyone, as it allowed for the first time for African heritage people to vote. And I'd be remiss if I talked about the Voters' Rights Act and not realize that coming up pretty soon, here on May 7th, was Bloody Sunday. The time that most of you have known of John Lewis and some of the others who walked across the Pettus Bridge just for the opportunity to cast a vote and was turned away and met with violence. Little talked about was Turnaround Tuesday. But once again, they were met with violence. So the importance of voting, of being a voter, is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It is something that I know is important to our country and our community. And to quote one of my pastors once talked about, he said, "These hands that were once brought here on a ship that picked cotton can now pick the President of the United States." And I still hold that near and dear. So I am very excited to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you so much. Our second speaker today will be Nate LeCoussier. He serves as a senior assistant county attorney in the civil division of the St. Louis County Attorney's Office in Duluth. Prior to joining the county attorney's office, Nate served as a senior lecturer for the Legal Studies and Criminal Justice program at UW-Superior, teaching courses ranging from law, citizenship, and civic engagement to constitutional law. Before that, he served as assistant city attorney for the city of Duluth under former mayor Don Ness, where he was recognized for his role in prosecuting and ending the sale of synthetic drugs at the former downtown head shop known as the Last Place on Earth. Nate is a 2007 graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. He lives in Duluth with his wife Nora and sons Henry and Charlie. Nate, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back. And I see Mose. Hey, thanks for jumping in. I'm not sure if Mose, if you had a chance to be in my law, citizenship, and civic engagement class, but it is really, really neat to be here with Carl, to be here with Don, and to discuss questions that, as you all know, are near and dear to my heart. I think just following up on, Carl's powerful introduction, one of the things that I had hoped to discuss today are what I will call sort of the big three United States Supreme Court cases since 2010, the second of which being Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, which was a 2013 decision that struck down Section 4A of the 1965 Voting Rights Act as it relates to pre-clearance of basic statewide changes for election requirements in states that had a long history of discrimination and disenfranchisement. So that's something that I think we'll follow up on, the critical importance of that continuing fight for civil rights, and this idea that democracy is in some respects the greatest threat to democracy. And what I mean by that is that within a democratic system, as participation dwindles, I see that as our greatest threat. Our constitutional and democratic system can be our strongest shield and protector in terms of electoral engagement and bringing always new and expanding and evolving voices into our process. And yet, by the same token, if there's no one watching the hen house, right, the fewer people that stay involved in this process, that opens the door to laws flowing from our constitutional system that nevertheless disenfranchise or weaken or lessen the power of the voices within our system. So I will definitely be returning to that in this conversation, but I'm going to get out of the way for Mayor Ness.
Thank you so much. We're glad to have you here. Finally, our final speaker will be Don Ness. Don Ness is part of the Ordine Foundation as the executive director. Established in 1933, the Ordine Foundation has a long, proud heritage of addressing issues of poverty in Duluth. Don has served for 16 years in elected leadership, culminating with a 91% job approval rating in his role as mayor of Duluth, a role he served from 2008 to 2016. During this time, he was honored with the titles of both Twin Cities Business Person of the Year and the Labovitz School of Business and Economics Business Person of the Year. He is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Duluth, majoring in business administration and economics, and he earned a master's in management from the College of St. Scholastica. Prior to his tenure as mayor, he was the campaign manager for Congressman Jim Oberstar for nearly 10 years. Don's core values include a deep dedication to his family and an ongoing spirit of service to his community. He and his wife, Laura, continue to live in Duluth with their 3 children, Eleanor, James, and Owen. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Don.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's neat to share the stage with Carl and Nate, 2 very good friends and 2 folks that I really have a tremendous amount of respect for, and thank you to UWS for hosting this discussion. And I think it's a really critically important discussion for where our country is at this moment in time, and really some of the threats to how our democracy functions and the role of the Constitution in that role. Carl, Nate, and I all have a basketball background, and when I was watching the Timberwolves play on Saturday and thinking about this, the basketball analogy did come to mind. So I'm going to go there to start out my comments. And thinking about a pickup basketball game in which 10 individuals show up, and they all have an idea of how the game is played. And there are a formal set of rules out there that, we all kind of understand that those rules exist and that they're written down. Very few people have spent the time to read line by line what those rules are, but everybody comes with a basic understanding of how the game functions. And if in this pickup basketball game, there is no referee, there isn't the person that's there to say exactly how things are supposed to run, but there is an understanding that the 10 individuals that show up are going to kind of abide by the spirit and the direction of those rules. But then in this fictional game, somebody decides that they can gain advantage over the other players by kind of bending the rules, kind of saying, establishing their own set of rules, and they start to, take advantage of that during the game, and they start to dominate the other players because they have set their own rules. And then there becomes this question of like, who enforces these rules? It takes somebody to stand up and say, no, that's not what the rules are. We have to do it a different way. Or it can be like, well, this person is violating the spirit of these rules. We're at a disadvantage. We ought to also violate those same rules in that same way in order so that we balance things out. And at some point, everybody starts to make up their own rules, and there is a question of what is the basis for the game that we all kind of have joined, and where is the integrity of that spirit. And I think that's the important thing as we think about our elections and think about our democracy, is that we do have the benefit of this Constitution and a Constitution that had a lot of foresight and have set forth, and it is a grand experiment of whether or not we can have this democracy and work well and represent the will of the people. And yet we have to recognize that our democracy and our Constitution is a human institution, and it does kind of bring, there are kind of human frailties and narrow interests that can look at the Constitution and say that is a given, and now I'm going to try to twist and manipulate the situation to my own personal and narrow advantage. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in recent years is almost taking for granted the strength of the institution, to say that the institution exists, the institution is our Constitution and is the rule of law, and it exists with a strength that is so strong that we can take that for granted and then kind of look out for our own interests and try to manipulate the process to our advantage. But at a certain point, if everybody is playing that same game, if everybody is kind of saying, how can I manipulate this situation for my own advantage, who is protecting the integrity of our system? Who is standing up for the rule of law? Who is looking out for the intent of the Constitution? And then you go down the line, are judges coming with true independence? Or are we in a situation in which the judges have been appointed by politicians and are bringing too much political interest and potentially changing that playing field to advantage one side or the other? How we think about our elections, are we all activists trying to kind of give political advantage to our side to the disadvantage of the other in any means necessary to get there? Or do we have citizens who say, while I may have my own political interest, my priority is protecting the integrity of these institutions, protecting the integrity of our democracy. And sometimes that means putting the interests of our country and the integrity of our system ahead of our own more narrow and personal political interests. So I think that's the thing that is really interesting and compelling to me in this day and age, where there's a lot of advantage and attention and almost lifting up those political figures that are kind of openly challenging the integrity of our institutions that that were based on our Constitution, and not enough attention and lifting up and supporting those who are doing the hard work and doing the behind the scenes work, and often don't get credit for kind of protecting the integrity of the institutions that we all benefit from, and that we all that are the true basis and strength of our democracy.
Absolutely. You made some really great points there. Thank you so much. So I'd like to just remind everyone, if at any point during today's panel you have any questions, please send them to the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you so much. So Carl, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. Don made some really amazing points. I hope I won that basketball game. I'm not sure, but great analogy. One of the challenges that we've also often faced with that people didn't realize from the 1965 Voters' Rights Act is there's a little small passage in there that's extremely important. And that passage is the opportunity for people with disabilities to vote. Often it's overshadowed by the right for African heritage people to vote, but that little part in that Voters' Rights Act is so key and important. I once had folks, one of the commissions I served with is the Commission on Disabilities. And I had a gentleman, when I first took my position here at the city, he came up to me and he said, Carl, he said, do you have any disabilities right now? I said, no, I'm doing okay. He said, if you live long enough, just wait, you will. And that is so key and important to understanding that. But understanding why is it important that everyone has the right to vote? And one of the key things here at City Hall through our clerk's office is to make sure that everyone have a safe, accessible place to vote. And when you look at some of the revisions of the John Lewis Voters' Rights Act, you'll see that some of the provisions are there to make it more accessible and equitable for everyone to vote. And as both Nate and Don talked about, that is so key. It hurts my heart when I hear young people throw their hands up and say, I'm not going to vote anymore. Because I know for me, there's blood on that ballot. And you have to vote. It's a right and it's an opportunity. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. Nate, if you'd like to follow up.
Yeah, I wanted to, and continuing with that powerful theme, there has been so much bloodshed, right? Pain, agony that has gone into broadening the franchise within this country. And it was interesting. I used to clerk for former United States Congressman David Mengy, and we were having a conversation in the wake of the Shelby County v. Holder decision. And he was shaking his head at sort of this place that we have arrived at today, where throughout much of our history, going back to Don's basketball analogy, we could all agree that we were generally playing the same game, and that there was a value to certain rules that no one questioned. And he noted that since its passage, the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized with broad bipartisan support. Prior to Shelby County v. Holder, I think George W. Bush would have been the last to sign off on major reauthorizations. There's never been a question that no matter how much we may disagree on political questions in this country, we have agreed that what sets us apart globally is that we protect the ability of all, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, background, to have access to pick our leaders. And that has started to change. You know, Don talking about sort of the tweaking of the rules, sort of the winning at all costs. The three decisions I talked about, or I wanted to talk about, Citizens United in 2010, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, starts this process whereby the Supreme Court determines that large organizations, corporate entities have speech rights, and that as part of speech rights, you can donate a great sum of money to the political process. And most folks talk about Citizens United in terms of speech rights as it relates to corporations. Something that we've seen in the wake of that decision is the creation of super PACs that since 2010 have spent billions of dollars on independent expenditures to sway ballot initiatives, referendums, and elections state by state. It's had an extraordinary impact on our political process. 2013, the Shelby County case that I discussed, prior to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, it was quite often the experience of African heritage voters throughout the South to run into literacy tests, poll taxes, ID requirements, registration requirements, even things as simple as in predominantly African heritage communities or neighborhoods, let's just have a single polling location, right? and let's have, you know, folks lining up around a block, right, just to get access to the poll. So what the Voting Rights Act did is say, okay, for states that have had this history, when you make voting changes, the Department of Justice has to take a look and check the box and say, okay, this is fair, this is above board, this rule works for everyone. The 2013 Shelby County case got rid of that requirement. And Justice Ginsburg, Chief Justice Roberts had noted, look, the country has changed, essentially saying we've made great strides since the Pettus Bridge. So we're not seeing the evidence that we need this requirement any longer. And Justice Ginsburg's response was, going out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Right? And it's just such a wonderful example of where we've come since 2013, which is as soon as we throw away that requirement, you start to see changes across the country, Texas and North Carolina being the most critical, where immediately you go back to enacting of whether it's a variety of voter ID requirements, a variety of different changes that we all know have a disparate impact on those who are less affluent, with less voice, right, with less privilege, such as someone like me, right? Look, on election day, I've got clearance to go. I'll get paid. If I forget my ID, I'll go back to my home because I have a home, right? I'll grab the utility bill and I can go back and I can wait in line for a couple hours. Well, I'm going to find a way to vote, right? But Shelby County took away some of that who's watching the henhouse protection. And following that, in 2019, then we get the Rucho v. Common Cause decision, which is where the Supreme Court said, when it comes to partisan gerrymandering, we're done, we're out. States, you figure it out. One of two things has got to happen. Either Congress acts to place a fair baseline standard for the entirety of the country, which is never going to happen, or individually, state by state, you've got to figure it out, right? And so what we see is this triumvirate problem. First, a lot of money, less legal protection, and then finally, hey, you're left to your own political devices state by state to figure this out. We're not going to ask whether there's an equal protection violation in Wisconsin or in North Carolina. The problem being, the question that's given rise is, how do you fix problems at the ballot box when there is so much money and legal authority to rig the ballot box? Right? So it's a nearly impossible task that's been set to us. And I'm not, as you all know, I'm an optimist, right? But we're facing some extraordinary challenges to get back to the beginning of Don's basketball game, right? The beginning of that place where we're gonna play hard. There's gonna be a winner and a loser, and that's not always gonna be fun, but at least we're gonna agree on the rules, right? And we're now at a place where we've moved beyond that, and we're fighting to get back to there. And that is critically important, because it's going to take all of us, and it's going to be a major fight.
Thank you so much. You make some really great points about, how do we get back to that basketball game, that original analogy that Don had made. So Don, if you'd like to keep the conversation going.
I'm thinking of when Carl and Nate talking about, these really critical moments in American history that, have been pivotal points. And again, I think we can take for granted the decisions that had been made, but understanding that in the moment, it required tremendous courage, and it required a recognition that our country wasn't operating in the way that, would best serve all of our people. And that change was needed. And I think, as we think about the Constitution, and even how we approach, or how we kind of think about the kind of remarkable, story of America, and starting with the Revolution and the writing of this Constitution that sets forth, our form of government. I mean, it is a remarkable story. And I think there's kind of two ways of thinking about that. One is kind of that originalism, which is like, God anointed these people that put down the words on the paper, and therefore that's how it always must be. And that there's an idea of kind of that American exceptionalism that is almost that I think there's a danger in kind of just buying into that idea that can translate into nationalism, and kind of a blind nationalism that just says, we are America and therefore we're in the right. But then there's another key concept that is in the Constitution, and that is kind of the striving for a more perfect union. And that idea recognizes that we are not a perfect nation, and that there isn't, a perfect starting point. But we have to recognize that there are areas of improvement, and there are things that we must address and continue that effort to become a better nation. And part of being undertaking that effort is the honesty to point out the flaws and in our failures. And only by pointing out the failures can we then find the courage to make those necessary improvements. And so I hope that we are kind of bringing forward and continually challenging ourselves to strive for that more perfect union, and to be able to be willing to say our love for our country requires us to be honest with ourselves and saying, here is our failures, and here's what we must do in order to become a better community or a better nation. And I think that's where, I do worry about a little bit of this concept of nihilism. And there's an economic nihilism, and I think there's a political nihilism, which says, what? Nothing matters, and everything is messed up, and there's power structures that are kind of beyond the ability to navigate or to influence. And so I'm just going to be out for number one, and if I, because nothing matters, if I can get my piece and satisfy my interests, or get, look at the power dynamics that will benefit me and my people, then that's all that I'm going to put my attention on. So I think as a country and as a nation and within our communities, we have to kind of recapture that sense of being honest about our failures, but kind of continuing to say the power and the greatness of our country is when we come together to support the whole and to strive for the strength of those institutions, the strength of our country, and to be the example for the world in a way that I think we've kind of lost sight of and have kind of strayed from in recent years.
Well, and Allie, it's so hard for me to hold, so I need to jump in just to pick up that thread immediately, because I think it's dead on, and something Don said I think is important for us to remember. So this is very messy. It was designed to be messy, right? From the very beginning. This was a system that was designed to be difficult, to require a great deal of push and pull. And there were going to be winners and losers from the very start, right? And yet I think that what is needed is exactly what we're doing here today, which is more of these conversations that help to build civic and constitutional knowledge and then I think just togetherness, having these conversations. We don't have these conversations enough, recognizing that the system is designed to be messy. I'm not going to suggest, as part of my recommendations here today, that we amend our Constitution, right? Because it's nearly impossible. If you've been in my classes, this is going to be very hard to do. Nevertheless, our system gives us a lot of tools. And over these last 2 months, as I have witnessed this expanding conflict in Ukraine, I have had enormous gratitude for feeling absolutely heartbroken for all impacted and all losing their lives on all sides of this conflict. And yet that sense of gratefulness and frankly privilege that we have in this country, where our decisions are not being driven by an authoritarian center, right? It is messy. There's some push and some pull. And yet I was teaching at UWS on January 6th, right? And I think it's important for us not to forget that when there is declining involvement or nihilism, as Don notes, right, we open the door. Because one thing that's not messy, right, is when you just decide one person gets to make all these calls, right? Like that's easy. So if we just get out of the way and one person makes all this, one person or a select few, well, sure, that's clean, right? And yet look where that eventually gets you, right? And so I think when we witness events like the storming on the Capitol on January 6th, that again needs to be our wake-up call. Now look, democracy is threatened. And it is critically important that we fight at all levels, local, state, national, to say, look, it is important, right? These institutions are important. We must protect them, right? Because as soon as you start that slide toward a cleaner, but certainly more authoritarian approach to governance, you see how quickly the voices of so many can be silenced when you arrive at that place.
Yes, you got it, Carl. Go for it.
Well, Nate and Don make such a great points there. One of the things I want to push or talk about is, for a lot of us, we've lost the opportunity to engage in real dialogue. I don't know about you, but it seems like the last 3 years, we went from listening to each other to I got to win and you got to lose conversations. And we see this now on the largest stage in our country. And as we're speaking to young people, college students, how are we giving them the tools to debate and to talk, to learn from each other? Some of the greatest things have come out of conflict, and some of the worst things have come out of conflict. We've lost the ability to just simply listen to each other and be willing to shake hands and say, you know, you have a right to feel that way, and so do I. But we have to reteach, relearn what it means to do that, to debate, to have meaningful conversation. And we often talk about when you come to a university or a school or an educational institution, when you graduate, you should not be the same person that walked in those halls the first time. So as a challenge, that's my alma mater at UWS, what are we really teaching? What are we giving our students the skills and opportunities to yield forward to that more perfect union? For that to happen, we got to have opportunities for people to listen to each other and learn from each other.
Yeah, and to learn from people with different perspectives and different, ideas. And, I often, say that a good functioning, a healthy democracy requires an exchange of ideas of different perspectives, and it requires conflict. And that's the messiness that Nate was talking about, and the ability, as Carl was mentioning, to hear from each other and to, that positive, creative solutions come out of the exchange of different ideas. And, in that democracy, when it works well is when there's kind of two opposing forces that are pushing against each other, and they're pushing extremely hard, and there's kind of resistance to the ideas. And there might be a little bit of movement. If one side is right, it's going to push a little bit in that direction. If the other side says, well, wait a minute, here's the counterpoint, and pushes a little bit back. But if you have those two in democracy that functions well, there is very little movement. And I think what we've seen in recent decades is society is kind of pulling away from each other and getting into our own circles and becoming more, and it's like a spring that's kind of pulling apart. And then we have these moments in which these ideas come together, but they're coming together with tremendous force, and then that can be destructive, and it can be challenging. And sometimes, one side, the pendulum swings way too far to one side, and then there's a reaction because the pendulum has swung too far, and so we swing it the other way. But that movement, it's oftentimes in that movement, the least powerful among us are the ones that take the damage. And if we get into into these games in which very powerful political and economic forces kind of are playing these games and almost encouraging this smashing together or trying to achieve, great movements, that it's, the poor or the folks that depend on the strength of institutions to protect their rights and protect their interests. If those institutions can't keep up with the movement, then it's those folks that are often taking the brunt of those challenges. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. Part is that we're kind of, social media tools allow us to get into these bubbles. We're even kind of sorting ourselves into communities that have like-minded folks. So we're lacking those opportunities to have those exchange of ideas that really facilitate understanding. And to Nate's point, the danger there is that we are now thinking that the perspectives of the other side, who are now further away, and we can characterize them in these very kind of simple two-dimensional ways, and we're saying they are so far gone that their ideas are illegitimate. And therefore, the moment that we say that, and both sides are doing it, the moment that we say that, then it's like, what, it would be so much easier if we just had our own authoritarian leader who would just come in and impose what we all know is the right way to do it, right? And as the liberals can say, like, we would love that, and like, let's strip away all the difficulties of dealing with conservatives, and then we can have this utopia. But the problem is that the other side would then be disenfranchised, and then they will kind of rise up in more and more kind of dangerous ways to try to, you know, overcome and claim their own position of authority through an authoritarian approach to their government. And of course, you know, this isn't theoretical. It's the exact situation that we see in so many countries all across the world. And we as Americans just haven't had to go through this process, in part because our leaders of the past have committed themselves to the problem solving, to the, you know, the striving for a more perfect union.
For sure. Loving the great conversation. Thank you all. Thank you. So good. Nate, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was just, Don, I was thinking about Conflict and Compromise by Ron Elving, which was sort of my required reading in first year, University of Minnesota Morris. And the whole idea, and okay, so this is 1998, folks, right? So college freshman, 1998, Conflict and Compromise. But the whole paradigm of thought there was that there was this great push and pull. And at the end, you arrived at a better place, right? Because there were trade-offs in this political discourse and dialogue. No one was getting everything that they wanted. And here we stand 24 years later, right? But this has happened quite quickly where, you know, sort of to Don's description, if you lose, the reaction is we burn it all down now, right? You delegitimize, you other, right? It's this practice of othering different constituencies, and, you know, finding our way back. You know, I wanted to, and this is happening all over the world, as Don noted. I think there's a documentary, The Edge of Democracy, I believe. I'll look it up and post it into the chat, but talking about sort of the rise of sort of political extremism in Brazil. We're seeing it across the European Union. We've certainly seen it within our own country, right? So we're getting these extreme pendulum swings, and those who have less power, less voice, always the ones that are getting caught then, right? And harmed by these extreme policies, regardless of who it is that's winning. It's almost like a little mini revolution happening every single time. There's this great buildup. And once you have your 51%, right, then you've got your mandate, right? Anything you can do, you will do, right? And that's very new in the history of political discourse in this country. So I wanted to offer some messages of hope, right? What do we do? My students would always ask me, okay, so if things are so broken on the national stage, what's the point, right? What's the point of voting? What's the point of engaging, right? And a couple of things I wanted to offer. So rather than saying, okay, I lost, so now that system is illegitimate and I'm going to burn it all down, we have a really extraordinary system, right? We have a really extraordinary system. And so as you see, for example, the Supreme Court start to move toward a more robust view of states, federalism, right? This old idea of states' rights, right? Keep the federal government out of how states are doing their business. That gives us all an opening, right? To engage locally at the town level, at the municipal level, at the statewide level. Read your state constitution if you haven't before. Say, okay, how would I go about amending my state constitution, right? I mean, I would say practice and play. Just start practicing and playing and having fun when it comes to engagement. And I think that really becomes the key, right? Because when you start to engage on your local level, you start seeing your neighbors eye to eye, whether you're talking about a street redesign project, right? Or a new dog park going in on the corner. What you're starting to do is you're starting to have these dialogues and you're starting to understand how local government works. More important, you're starting to see and recognize your voice has power, right? Your voice has great meaning. And it may seem small at the start, and yet when you start to build those blocks up from that local level, that town, municipal, statewide level, that carries through then and has an impact on the federal level, right? And so that I've been seeing of late, where you see that nihilism, I say meet that with just having fun with the democratic tools that we wake up with every single day. And man, are we lucky, right? Because in a lot of parts of the world, you have none of those tools.
For sure. Really appreciate that little bit of hope. We have a really great audience question for you all. So Ephraim asks, one of the issues we face is how these things are framed as existential threats. How do we allay the fears of people?
Okay, which one do you want to tackle that one?
I was going to ask, Carl, if you'd be willing to unmute and ask that question, elaborate a bit. In terms of which things are being framed as existential threats and how we go about it.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. So we know that when we are looking at things like elections and, we look at the uprising and all that, sometimes many of these things are framed as, hey, if we allow these people to win, they are going to change our way of life. We will not be who we think we are. So it becomes very ethnocentric, and it is about destroying our way of life, right? So if we give in to these people, our way of life will be destroyed. And that is why we start making the rules in the middle of the game, as Don was saying. It is, I have to win at all costs because this is about my life. This is about my way of life. This is, it's just going to destroy my community. It's going to destroy what I believe to be the right way for us to live and do things. And I think the way politicians and, mostly people frame, and some of our religious leaders will frame it that way. The way they are framed, then people are ready to go to whatever extent they want, or they think they could go to change the rules to make sure that, they get to maintain what they think to be the right way to do things, or the right way to live, or the way things are supposed to be. That is why I think fear becomes a key factor in how we go about doing this. And how do we get people to understand that inclusivity doesn't mean you are destroyed, your way of life is going to be destroyed. It is about bringing more people in, expanding the cake, expanding the way we live, and not necessarily just destroying people's way of life. I think those are key things that sometimes get missing in the conversation. And we need to really figure out a way to get people to that point.
I love that question, and the points that you make are spot on, and I think really put your finger on the dynamic that is kind of that politicians have tapped into, and it is a fear-based politics, and it is the idea that if the other side, as Nate was saying, if the other wins, then we are at risk, and part of the dynamic, and it's almost become conventional wisdom within our politics, is that, if we have power, our role to use that power is to reward our friends and punish our enemies, right? And so if that is in part the promise that we're bringing, if politicians are bringing to the table, saying, if you elect me, you will reap the rewards of me being in power. And not only that, but those others over there, I'm going to take steps to punish them and make them miserable, and we'll all rejoice in their misery, right? And so I think, one of the starting points and the place that you can change that dynamic is to, one, not, support the politicians that play into that fear-based politics, but flip the script. And it's hard to do, but that's where democracy is, and that's where the health is not to reward your friends and punish your enemies, but rather to challenge your friends, to challenge the people that you are close with, and to say, hey, let's talk about, the tactic that you're using. Yes, I understand that tactic, supports our side, but what is the damage that is doing to our country and our democracy? Let's have that conversation. And that's not an easy thing. And we've actually lost the ability to have challenging conversations with our friends. And so, of course, if we can't have challenging conversations with our friends, there's no way in the world that we're going to have challenging conversations with the other side. So it's being willing to challenge our friends and then reach out to the folks on the other side, and to look and to go out of our way to say, you know what, we may disagree on 90% of the things, but here's a commonality. Here's an idea that I think it has some merit, and I'm not going to reject it out of hand just because you're from, the other perspective.
I was thinking about this idea of shared story, and I think this was actually Don in one of my classes. You had discussed this. Too often we allow ourselves to get drawn into that. There's this single leader, and they're facing all of these overarching problems, and now support them because they'll make them all go away. I think something we've lost is that shared story of democracy. That very much cares about where we end up, right? The tactics being used, if they're harming our institutions, that is counter to a shared and inclusive story, right? And a time where our story looked more akin to give us your tired, give us your poor, right? America is sort of the beacon of freedom and lifting up all those regardless of heritage, ethnic and religious backgrounds, right? And I think our story has fractured a bit, right? Just to be frank, our story has fractured, where now we're starting to see very powerful alternate stories, right? Seeking to advance the interests of a particular viewpoint to the exclusion of many others. And so I think getting back to that, recognizing and understanding that democracy, it is messy, it will be hard, and yet this grand experiment continues, right? We're not an old country in global history at all, extremely young one, and yet already our democratic constitution is the oldest surviving in the world, right? So I think we're still writing that, hopefully not ending. Right? Hopefully we're in the middle, right? And we're continuing to add and write chapters. But I think the language that we use, right, and the manner in which we have that dialogue that Carl discusses, critically important. It has to be inclusive. We can't close in. We have to look at these tactics, maybe even if we win, like Don says. Are we helping or harming where this country stands when, my sons, Henry and Charlie, are picking up and taking over the reins?
Thank you for that, Nate. And Ephraim, thank you for that question. One thing I want to make sure, Ali, I'm able to touch upon is this conversation needs to happen not only on the college campus, but in the junior high schools. We need to get to the middle school level. We need to talk to people about taking care of your rights. A lot of people have made mistakes. I mean, we're all going to make mistakes, but some of those mistakes have actually cost them the opportunity to vote, to change their community, the outcome for their families. And it's important that we start to share and understand what that means to be able to cast a ballot. And yes, we focus a lot on the presidential race. What happens locally is equally, if not more important. And you got to be able to take part of the democratic process, but know that there are ways that you can lose that right. And we have to educate our young people about that because it's so important. So thank you for letting me be a part of this deep discussion today. I'm so excited that I had an opportunity to be a part of this.
So I think I'll kind of make a few closing comments and kind of this broader historical perspective. And there's a book that's gotten a lot of attention, and it's called Generations, or the Fourth Turning. And it's an idea that there are these 80-year cycles in American history, and they look at that the culmination of these 80-year cycles had been the revolution itself, the Civil War, the Depression in World War II, and then this book that was written in the early 90s pointed to the 2020s and said, most likely, if this pattern continues, that we will see the culmination of the next 80-year cycle culminate in the 2020s. And here we are. And we are seeing those institutions being tested. But the positive thing is that in each case, that there was a new generation that emerged that says there is a better way of doing this. And we will kind of take the steps necessary to protect the integrity of our country and put it on a different path. And then that was the very basis for the prosperity that was to come. And so it's the young people today that hopefully will take a look at all these folks in their 70s who are leading our country down the wrong path and to say, we reject that way of doing our politics. We have a better way of doing it. And here it is. And once they're empowered with that, hopefully a sense of purpose and direction, that will be the basis for, this grand experiment that we call America and the next round of prosperity.
Thank you all so much for this really critical, crucial, important conversation. We're so happy to have you all here with us today to start this discussion. So just a quick thank you to everyone for attending the Link Center's Law Day panel today. Obviously, special thank you to Dawn, Carl, and Nate. We couldn't have done it without you all. And thank you so much for providing your nonpartisan thoughts, experiences, and reflections on today's topics. And we greatly appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming.